Hello, Amber. I am Lydia. I am your nurse, and you're in the hospital. You had an accident, but you are going to be just fine. The doctor is on his way. He'll be here in a few minutes. I know you have a lot of questions, and we will do our best to answer them, but not until the doctor arrives. Okay. Sure, replied Amber uncertainly. Now, I'm going to take your vitals. Okay. Amber nodded slowly in reply. The nurse spoke with a cheerful self-assurance, talking about various nonsensical things, as she went about taking Amber's vitals. I could tell the nurse's manner had a calming effect. Amber was not as tense and frightened as she was a minute before, although her confusion remained evident. Okay, everything is in order, announced Lydia brightly, as she finished her task. Amber had followed the nurse's movements with her eyes as she worked. Now, she looked back at us, and a slight smile appeared on her face. I started to return the smile with one of my own when I noticed where she was looking. She was looking past me and at her parents. I stepped back, making room for her parents to approach her bed. Up until then, we'd all remained silent, letting the nurse do all the talking as she went about her business, while we looked on. "Hi, honey," said Amber's mom in greeting to her daughter. "Mom, why am I in the hospital? What happened to me?" Amber's voice, although she still appeared relatively calm, was quavering with trepidation and confusion. As the nurse said, "You had an accident. Let's wait for the doctor, and then we can talk more about it." "Okay, sweetheart," said Mrs. Morton soothingly. "Okay, but why am I so weak? I feel like I've been lying here forever." "I know, honey." Mrs. Morton looked up at the nurse, and Lydia nodded for her to go on. "You've been in the hospital for a while, but you're better now." I could hear the unshed tears in Mrs. Morton's voice as she spoke, but it didn't seem Amber noticed. My concern was how Amber would react once she was told and saw the extent of her injuries. It was my great fear that Amber might become catatonic again. "What accident, Mom? Dad?" Looking at me, she continued, "Joe, what accident?" I wanted to go to her and hold her, to comfort her as I told her about the accident and of her injuries, and how sorry I was. Most of all, I wanted to tell her how much I loved her and that I would be with her every step of the way as she continued to recover. Instead, I said, "We'll tell you all about it as soon as the doctor joins us." "Why? Why do I have to wait for the doctor? What is wrong? Why won't you tell me now?" Amber's voice rose with each question, until she was practically screaming with the beginnings of hysteria. I rushed to her side without thinking, and with no more thought than anyone gives to any particular breath they take, I said, "I love you." Amber's face went slack for a moment before a look of utter surprise and wonder replaced the wild expression she wore before my words. "You love me, Joe? Really?" she asked in a whisper of disbelief. "Yes, Amber, I love you." Not wanting to give her time to think, I hurried on. "After you left Paris, I realized I missed you. I missed you terribly. Those 2 weeks you spent with me are 14 days I will always cherish. When I returned home and I saw you again, I knew, without a doubt, that I love you." A slight frown crossed her features as I told her how much I missed her, but her eyes lit up when I told her again I love her. "But Joe, what about Sheila?" "Yes, what about Sheila? Sheila has fought me every step of the way, but 2 weeks ago the judge finally agreed to grant the divorce. So, in about 30 days my divorce will be final. No matter what. Sheila can't stop it." Amber's eyes glistened as she listened to me, and when I finished explaining, she said, "Oh, Joe, I'm so happy for you. I'm also sad, for both you and Sheila. She does love you, Joe. It was my fault." I interrupted her by kissing her. She responded in kind, although I think she surprised herself. "No, baby, it wasn't. If anyone is to blame, it's Sheila. So no more talk about whose fault it is." "Okay." She looked at me, eyes staring, searching my face, before replying, "Okay, Joe." About then a booming voice interrupted us. "Well, how is my second most favorite patient doing?" As I heard the words, I turned to glance behind me. A tall man, dressed in a white doctor's frock, had entered the room. He was an older man, his gray hair testament to his age, although his face remained remarkably wrinkle-free. He was also a large man, a very large man. I have seen taller men, and I have seen heavier men, but I had never seen a man as tall with his girth combined together in one individual as this doctor. I have been staying with Amber on the weekday evenings and most of the weekends, and I have met all the nurses on all the shifts and some of the doctors, but I'd never met this doctor. I noticed that the elder Mortons, upon seeing the doctor, gave him warm, welcoming smiles. I guess they knew this doctor, and they were obviously glad to see him. He nodded a greeting at them and then gave me a small, quick smile. Amber simply stared at him, dismay on her face. "I'm Dr. Lloyd Simpson, Amber. I'm your neurosurgeon. Now, I realize you might not recognize me, at least not without my surgical mask, but I have been taking care of you since you arrived at our little medical haven of heaven." Chuckling at his own joke, he smiled at Amber and then turned around and grinned, blinding us with his 100-watt smile. Turning back to Amber, his timbre changed, becoming more serious as he spoke to her. "Well, young lady, I'm sure you're wondering why you're here and under my care, right? Yes, I can see that you're definitely wondering. I wish I could tell you that you want a free stay at our wonderful facility, but I'd be lying." He stopped to take a breath, a deep breath, a breath that I was sure had just sucked up half the air in the room, before he continued with his explanation. "Amber, you were in an accident. You were brought here, and we worked on you until we had you stabilized. Then later, we worked on you some more to repair some other damage caused by the accident. You sustained some extensive cranial injuries which caused a few complications. You also had broken bones. We took care of all your injuries, however, parts of you were severely injured." He paused to look at the nurse and something passed between them. Whatever it was that went on between them, I saw a deep sadness settle into his face. "Amber, we tried our best, but we couldn't save your left leg." Until that point, Amber hadn't realized she was missing that part of her anatomy. We really hadn't given her a chance to notice in the few minutes she'd been awake, and my greatest worry was that I didn't know how she would react. Hell, if I woke up missing a limb, I wouldn't know how I would react. At first, I didn't think Amber had comprehended what the doctor stated, but then her face slowly contorted in horrified shock. She opened her mouth fully, but not a sound came out. Yet, I knew she was screaming. I felt my chest constrict and my heart beat rapidly in sympathy. She struggled to sit up and to move her head enough to look at her legs. The nurse quickly moved to help her. Amber stared at her legs an infinite moment before her one foot moved slowly about, then a jerky movement of the leg of where her stub lay under the sheet. Then Amber sort of slumped and the nurse gently lowered her back onto the mattress. Amber had closed her eyes, and I saw tears leak out of the corners. They ran in single rivulets down the side of her temples to disappear in her now disheveled hair. I wanted to go to her and hold her, but I wasn't sure if that would be the best thing to do. The room had of a sudden gone from an unexpected jocund event to one filled with a palatable tension and abject horror. "Amber, I know this is hard to deal with, but trust me, it can be overcome," the doctor said in a surprisingly soft, consoling tone of voice. "Amber, honey, it'll be okay. Your father and I will be here with you throughout it all. We'll help you." Throwing me a quick questioning look, at which I nodded, Mrs. Morton added, "Joe will be here for you, too." The doctor moved closer to Amber's bed, his huge body seeming to dwarf both the bed and Amber. "Amber, there is something else." For some reason, his words focused Amber's attention as she lifted and turned her tear-streaked face to look at him, her brimming eyes steady even as they filled with renewed fear at whatever else he would say. "You've been here in the hospital for about 6 months. You were in a coma during that time, until you awoke a few minutes ago. You're healed of most of your injuries. However, I would like to run some tests as soon as possible. I'll schedule the tests for first thing in the morning, and that way we can get them over with." Amber looked ever so lost, and with each word the doctor uttered, she seemed to become even more disoriented. I knew the feeling, and I could see Amber's thoughts reflected in her horror-stricken eyes. I fairly knew what she was thinking as the doctor spoke. "This can't be happening to me. Not me. This happens to other people. Not to me." Amber's discovery of a lost limb and a long-term coma certainly doesn't equate to the discovery of a cheating spouse. Yet, The initial emotional reaction to any unexpected, grievous personal event is a shared shock of roiling turmoil and yawning disbelief. Then immediately after, the unremitting emotional pain and the ever-deepening horror come crashing in. And yes, even as we suffer through each of those instantaneous stages, we also begin our denial of the event. So, yeah, although I didn't know her exact thoughts, I'm not a mind reader, I had a good idea of what they consisted. I watched as all those aforementioned emotions played across Amber's face, her expressions not fully forming before another took its place, until a look of utter bewilderment settled in. It had been too much, too quickly, in too short a time for Amber. Even as I witnessed Amber's reactions to the doctor's news, my own emotions were also boiling over. So much so that I was unable to bear seeing any more of Amber's anguish. Thus, I leapt in. "Amber, look at me." Slowly her eyes moved toward me, and I thought I saw a glimmer of pleasure in her eyes as they met mine, before they became filled with a dull look once more. "Amber, remember Paris?" I asked with a slight smile. She looked at me, her emotional state clearly etched in by the strained lines on her face. Yet, she managed to add mild confusion to that emotional collage. "Paris? What about Paris?" "The night you fell and were injured, and after, when you left the hospital and where you stayed to convalesce. Do you remember that part of your stay in Paris?" Nodding in reply, her tormented expression briefly changed as her own slight smile crossed her lips. "What about it, Joe? This isn't the same. I've lost." "I know, Amber. I know. I realize your injuries are far more severe this time. But please, hear me out." "Okay," I asked of her pleadingly and hoping no one, not her parents, not the nurse, and not the doctor, interrupted my one-man show. After a moment's hesitation, Amber nodded her agreement. She seemed to become somewhat angry, which I thought was a good sign. It was better than the anguish I saw a few moments earlier. "Thank you. I'll be short." I took a breath to calm myself and to get some time to gather my thoughts. It was Amber who lay in bed, missing a leg, and in shock over the circumstances she awoke to find herself in, after being in a coma for months. Yet, I felt like the prisoner about to be led to the gas chamber. I really needed to convince Amber of my feelings for her and to help her to cope with her situation. I knew that whatever I said, it had to be from my soul and from my heart. It was the only way that what I said would get through to her and not lose her. "Amber, honey, I'm talking about how we bonded, how we connected during that time in Paris. I admit I was not very happy having you there, at least at first. But after you moved in, I got to know you better. I realized you weren't the gal I always thought you were. Kind of how what you thought of me changed before you left to return home, right?" "Yes, Joe, I remember. But what has that got to do with?" "Please, honey, you said you would listen to what I had to say." "Okay, go on. But I don't think what you have to say is going to return my leg or fix whatever else is wrong with me," she said, with heavy bitterness dripping off every word. I knew her patience was quickly coming to an end, and I thought I also detected a detached tiredness in her voice. "My point is, you weren't alone. We spent time together and we talked. We spoke of all sorts of things. And in that time, as I grew to know you better, I also began to like having you around. And I'm pretty sure your own feelings for me changed and grew as well. I know that when you left Paris, I was deeply saddened to see you go." Amber's eyes widened slightly at my revelation, but she didn't say anything as she waited for me to finish. "Honey, I know you've awoken to a nightmare. I can't imagine what you must be feeling right now, but I can say, with the utmost certainty, that you are not alone and won't be alone. Yet, none of us, not your parents, not me, not anyone can do for you what you must do to gain your life back, but we can help you in many other ways." She opened her mouth to say something, but I kept going, not stopping to take a breath. "I'll help any way I can, no matter the cost. I'll do whatever it takes, whatever you need, so you can get better. Because, Amber, I need you. I love you. And I know you love me." Amber closed her mouth slowly as she locked her eyes to mine. Then she dropped her gaze. Her head lay turned toward me, but her eyes had closed. "Joe, I think I remember we went out. It was raining. You covered me with your jacket. Then you kissed me. I remember I was getting wet from the rain. You held me, Joe. I like that. But something. I'm not sure what. I can't remember. But something happened and you weren't there anymore. I think I searched for you. I looked everywhere. I think I heard your voice, but I could never find you. She stopped speaking, opened her eyes, and looked at me once more. Joe, did we go dancing? I have this thought we went dancing. Did we, Joe? Did we dance? I tried my best to keep my voice from breaking. I knew she had heard me reading to her every one of those nights, and those times she called out my name. Well, it added up with what she just explained. Looking at her, I shook my head. No, sweetie. We didn't go dancing. We were going to, but... At that point, Dr. Simpson spoke up, his booming voice filling the room with his deep timbre of a voice. I imagined the furniture and fixtures vibrating in synchronization with his words. I think that's enough for now. Miss Morton needs to have some time to process what she's been told. I turned to argue, but his look stopped me cold. Where his facial expression appeared cheerful and gregarious, his eyes were not. I blinked with unexpected surprise. A shock, really, but when I focused on his eyes again, they twinkled with an inner mirth. I glanced at Amber's parents as I shook my head to clear my thoughts of what I thought I'd seen in the doctor's eyes. But upon seeing their disagreeable expressions, I quickly looked away. Instead, I turned to look at Amber. The doctor is right, honey. This is a lot for you to take in all at once. We can talk more later. Okay. Amber appeared ready to argue, but then nodded her head and sighing, she asked, Will you stay near me, Joe? Please. Of course I will, honey. I'm not going far. I'll be in the waiting area. I guess I can share, since your folks need some time with you, too. I smiled at them as I said that, but they didn't seem too pleased at my feeble attempt at humor. I'll return in a little while and sit with you. Okay. Amber grabbed my hand before I could walk off, and with surprising strength for a person who had just awoken from months-long coma, pulled me to her. Kiss me, Joe. What could I say or do, other than as ordered? I walked out with a sheepish grin. I didn't dare look at Amber's parents, nor did I look at the doctor. I had this sense that he was grinning widely, anyway. I hadn't spoken to Richards in several days. Then one day he called to explain. Richards, line 4. Some doctor from Albany Medical Center. One of the nearby detectives called out loudly. It was toward the end of the day. A rather long and tiring day. Richards had been reviewing the notes and the forensic reports of a baffling murder case he'd been assigned when he heard his name called. He was weary and had been deep in thought, thus he was somewhat startled by the interruption. Then it hit him. Albany. Sheila Pleasant. The doctors tending to her. Lieutenant Richards. Central Investigations. How can I help you? A female's voice, accented with an easily discernible British posh, replied, Lieutenant Richards, I am Dr. Potty of the Albany Medical Center. I am the attending physician for one of our patients, a female by the name of Sheila Pleasant. There is a note attached to this patient's medical file stating that we are to inform you of when Mrs. Pleasant has awoken, and when she was lucid enough to speak intelligibly. She is awake, and as far as we can determine, she is fully cognizant. Dr. Potty, is it? Yes, Lieutenant. When did she wake up? Assuming she didn't come out of the coma on her own? No, she did not awaken out of the coma on her own. We gradually reduced the medication that induced the coma over a period of several days. She's been fully aware the last 12 days. I see. After a moment's pause, Richards asked in a carefully modulated neutral tone, Why wasn't I informed at the time she awoke? Mrs. Pleasant had to be examined and several tests conducted before we could determine if she had sustained any neurological damage to her physiological capabilities and whether she had impairment to her psychological abilities. Her cranial injuries were very severe, which included intracranial and intracerebral hemorrhaging. Either one of those injuries could have easily caused irreparable damage. That the patient suffered such grievous injury and survived is a miracle of its own. The fact that we can discover no apparent aberration is another, much greater, miracle. She completed all her exams last night. I called you as soon as I finished reviewing the results of those exams. It is why I can state that the patient is fully cognizant as best as we can determine, testily explained the doctor. Okay, doctor. I meant no offense. Thank you for explaining her previous condition and her present condition. No offense taken, Lieutenant. I have several other patients that I still need to attend. So is there anything else you require? I have a few more questions, doctor. Has anyone spoken to Mrs. Pleasant regarding her accident? And have you contacted her husband to tell him his wife is awake? After a few moments of silence, which had Richards thinking they had disconnected, Potty replied, As far as I know, none of my staff has discussed the accident with the patient. However, the patient seems to have full recall of the entire accident. Of her own volition, she has spoken of it a few times. To anyone who will listen, she has become extremely agitated on more than one occasion as she remembered the details. We've had to sedate her twice. When was this? Once yesterday and once today. As to the patient's husband, we haven't notified him as of yet. As per your instructions, we contacted you first. One of the staff will call to inform the husband of her present condition as soon as we are done with this call. I see. It seems Mrs. Pleasant is well enough to answer some questions. Receiving no immediate reply to his statement, Richards asked, Is that so, doctor? From a purely medical perspective, yes, the patient should be able to answer any questions posed to her. Lieutenant, answered Fatty, in precise clipped tones. I see. When will Mrs. Pleasant be released to go home? Several more days. Perhaps weeks, replied Dr. Fatty, brusquely. By her terse manner, Richards could tell the doctor was clearly irritated at the extended questioning. He was going to have to hurry it up before she lost her patience and hung up on him. I see. Okay, doctor. One more thing. I wish you wouldn't call her husband, Joseph Pleasant, until after I've had a chance to question Mrs. Pleasant. Also, I'm requesting that your hospital post someone from security outside her door to prevent her leaving the hospital. At least, until I can have one of your local law enforcement officers arrive to secure her. She's a person of interest in another incident. I would hate it if she left your care before I could question her. In a voice devoid of emotion, yet somehow filled with ire, Dr. Potty told the policeman, This is something you should know, Lieutenant Richards. By law, we have to inform the family as soon as the condition of any patient changes, if the patient so chooses. And she has, Lieutenant Richards. Mr. Pleasant will be contacted as soon as you and I are finished. As we are a hospital and not a prison, I find it personally detestable to forcibly restrain a patient who has not shown any indications of violence to herself or to others, and by your own admission has committed no crime. That notwithstanding, the patient is at this time immobile and still under medical observation in the intensive care unit, and will not be transferred to a room for at least another 24 hours. The only access doors in the ICU are a set of double doors and an emergency exit. However, I will inform our security staff of your request. Is there anything else? Okay, Doc, you got me. But how about if I call Mr. Pleasant myself and... The doctor's interrupting delivery was like a meat cleaver chopping through bone. Lieutenant, you can do whatever you like. It does not change what we are required to do. Now, I must be going. The sharp click of the phone being hung up seemed to echo within Richard's head. The lieutenant was already bone-weary before the phone call, and despite the short conversation with the doctor, the call felt as if it had sucked out the last of his remaining energy. As weary as he was, Richards briefly pondered what the doctor meant by the patient being immobile. Well, he would soon discover that for himself. He hadn't slept properly in 3 weeks, not since his ex-wife had unexpectedly shown up at his doorstep asking, no, begging him to let her stay with him until she got back on her feet. It had been 16 months since their divorce was finalized, and he had seen neither hide nor hair of his ex-wife, Linda, in that time. Her sudden appearance had been an unpleasant surprise for the lieutenant. Yet, what could he do but take her in? Apparently, the loser she had left him for had spent or stolen all the money Linda had won in the divorce settlement, leaving her destitute and stranded out of state. Linda had called Richards several times over the previous 2 months, but as he was always busy with investigations, he had let her calls go to voicemail or outright rejected them. He had meant to call her, but never found the time. Or rather, he never found the need to call her. She was the mother of both his boys, and they would have taken a dim view of their mother living on the street. At the thought of his boys, Richard's chest swelled with pride. Both of his boys had become police officers. Following in the footsteps of their father and their grandfather, they had excelled at the academy and had become beat cops, but were vying for lieutenant. His boys knew what their mother had done, and of course, they'd been livid at her deed. But they'd also been disappointed at their parents' divorce. At first, in a desperate attempt to save their parents' marriage, the boys had mentioned counseling and reconciliation to Richards, but they quickly learned their father was not so inclined. Still, they didn't give up on the idea until Linda, on the day the divorce was finalized, left the city with the clown she called a soulmate. By then, the boys had pretty much marginalized their mother to 304 status. Still, she was their mother, and as such, deserved some form of respect and some small degree of kindness. His boys were wary of their mother, but seemed genuinely happy that she'd returned and was living with their dad, although they were under no illusions as to where the relationship stood between their parents. Linda quickly found a good job, with good pay and some benefits, but she still lacked enough funds to move out of Richard's house. She had tried to pay her way, but Richards refused, insisting she save her money so she could get her own place as soon as possible. She never said anything overt, but Richards had the impression that his ex-wife was hoping he would allow her to stay indefinitely and perhaps to reconcile their relationship. Despite his perceived kindness towards Linda, Richards had no intention of picking up where he and his ex-wife had left off before she cheated and run off, and he was certain that is where the problem lay. It's why he wasn't getting enough sleep. Each evening, Linda would come in from work to clean the house, cook supper, and wash the dishes, then go to her room and sob quietly for hours. As far as Richards was concerned, her sobbing, as quiet as it was not quiet enough, keeping him awake well into the early morning hours. Her sounds of self-torment didn't fill him with guilt or regret, but she had once been his wife, and she'd been a good wife. For a time, that remembrance had him feeling a slight sense of responsibility for her well-being. Whether it was the good cop in him feeling concern or simply the former husband reacting, he didn't know. But the discomfort that filled him each night, in hearing her emotional plight, was what kept his mind troubled well into the night. It couldn't keep going on like it has been. If she didn't move out soon, he was going to have to take drastic measures. Richards didn't yet know what those measures would entail, but considering his bone-weary, sleepless state, they'd be sure to be extreme. Rolling his shoulders to help ease his tired and aching muscles, he reached for the phone to call Albany's police department and to call Joe Pleasant, of course. I don't think Richards was very happy with my tagging along with him to Albany. Not that I cared how he felt, but it would have made the drive a bit more pleasant. We'd been arguing over who would do what and when on arrival. "I don't care what questions you have for your wife, Mr. Pleasant," said Richards, stressing the word, you. "Your own concerns will wait until I'm finished questioning her." Eyeing me critically, he continued, "Police business trumps personal curiosity. I should have driven up on my own, rather than ride with this police buffoon, but it is what it is. I tried a different tack. What's going on with you, Lieutenant? One minute you're a good old boy, the next minute you're Attila the Hun. What gives? It can't all be police tactics. Are you bipolar or something? Shut it, Pleasant." Richards growled. I looked at him in some concern. His voice was charged with emotion, and it wasn't simply from anger. He also had the maniac look of a man that hadn't slept in a while. I looked out the side window as I contemplated his harangue to my situation. Something about how he was acting seemed to strike a familiar chord. "So, she cheated on you?" He turned his head so rapidly, I thought it would continue turning and spin right off. But it was his look of slack-jawed surprise and wide-eyed shock which confirmed my suspicions. "What? How?" The lieutenant began before abruptly breaking off whatever he was going to say. He seemed to recover as quickly as he'd been surprised, as his face instantly set into its usual grimness. In more natural movement, he slowly turned back to face the road. After a moment, he began again. "What game are you playing at, Pleasant?" "Not my game, Lieutenant. You just seem to be behaving like a man with a lot of personal stuff on his mind, and your reactions are reminiscent of something that I once experienced." In my case, what I felt and the attitudes I exhibited were caused by a cheating wife. I just assumed you were caught up in the same game. After a couple of moments of uncomfortable silence, and when he hadn't responded, I explained, on our last road trip, when we went to Sheila's folks' cabin, you mentioned you were divorced. As for the rest, I simply put two and two together. Richards nodded his head as he firmly stated, I'm divorced, saying it as if to reaffirm it. So what? You caught her with another man? Posing the question with what I hoped Richards would take as a sympathetic note. I had no interest in the policeman's personal life, but I was striving to make the lengthy trip a more tolerable one. I can't say I wasn't deriving some measure of pleasure in needling the police lieutenant, but mostly my rationale was based on taking my mind off of the reason for the trip to Albany. Something like that, replied Richards absently, as he appeared to concentrate on what lay in the road ahead, which was more road. Unsure of how to reply, I mulled over several options. However, before I could utter anything, Richards quietly added, She returned. Oh, she returned. I assumed Richards meant his ex-wife. So, I said the only thing that came to mind. I see. It isn't such a bad phrase. No sooner had the last vowel escaped my lips when Richards turned his head slightly to send me a withering glare. Well, I didn't wither, but his look did mollify my opinion of those two simple little words. Yes, I definitely enjoyed using that phrase. I was beginning to understand why cops used it. After giving the policeman a few moments to compose himself, I asked somewhat innocently, So, what's the problem, Lieutenant? I waited for a reply. As the seconds ticked by, I figured Richards wasn't going to answer my question. Then to my surprise, he let out a soft sigh and began explaining. What isn't the problem? When Linda, my ex, decided she hated being married to a cop, she also decided she loved being somebody else's bitch. She'd hooked up with someone she'd met at some art gallery. A French guy. An artist. Oh, she tried to hide the affair. At first, anyway. One night, when it became too difficult for Linda to explain her late nights out and her shitty attitude toward me, we had a whopper of a fight, after which she up and left. Moving in with that French artist, the desire for the divorce was mutual. She wanted her artist, and I wanted rid of a 304. Before the ink was dry on the divorce papers, she was gone. She'd run off with that lowlife. Momentarily stunned by Richard's frank openness, I didn't immediately have anything to say in response, which, as it turned out, was a timely thing, as the now gloomy-faced cop continued his story. My boys, I have two boys, both grown, were upset at what their mother had done to them and to me. Still, she is their mother, and they love her. So when she showed up at my doorstep, nearly begging me to give her a place to stay, I felt I had no choice but to let her. After flicking an interrogative glance in my direction, and satisfied at whatever expression I wore, he went on. My boys, well, they are still angry with her, but I know them. If I had turned her away, they would have been angry with me as well. I don't know what happened with her and her a-hole lover. Richard's voice had risen to nearly a shout at the mention of his wife's lover, but he stopped, took a deep breath, and exhaled slowly before finishing what he started to say. In a more normal voice, Whatever happened, Linda returned broke and alone. She's found a job, so I expect her to be out of my hair soon. Sighing again, more deeply than before, he said quietly, more to himself than to me, For now, she cries at night, and, well, it keeps me awake. Then, in an even more subdued voice, making me one grumpy a-hole. After a moment of awkward silence, he cleared his throat with a loud noise, asking, gruffly, Have any more questions, Mr. Pleasant? I hope not, because I want to listen to the silence. You get my meaning? Yeah, sure, I said offhandedly, my mind, pricked by Richard's story, already adrift in my own remembrances, and of the single reason we were going to Albany. Have I mentioned I hate hospitals? The Albany Medical Center building was no exception. It was a busy place. I think there were as many doctors and nurses moving to, and for as there were patients, and some of those were not moving at all. Its medically inspired decor, no doubt designed to calm and placate the seemingly endless number of people waiting to be tended to, was dreary and depressing to me. I had never truly considered just how many injured and sick people existed, Multiply that by the number of hospitals just in the US alone, and the number was probably in the tens of millions. I could have used my BlackBerry to look up the exact figures, but why depress myself even more? So it was with this unnerving sagacity that I followed the lieutenant into the elevator and out onto one of the floors of the building designated the Neurosciences Center. Neither Richards nor I had spoken since his candid explanation on the drive up, which had suited me just fine, and probably him even more so. Since arriving at the medical center, the policeman had acted like he knew where he was going, and had continued moving unhesitatingly, flashing his police identification a couple of times, until we were before a slightly ajar hospital room door. I wondered idly about that as I followed him down a large corridor, concluding that either he had been here before or he'd gotten directions before driving up. The latter seemed mostly likely. The placard located next to the door, under the room number, had the patient's name and some sort of medical code written on it. It was Sheila's room. I stared at Sheila's name on the placard for a second, but it was long enough to reach deep inside and to examine what I felt now and what I thought I would feel upon seeing my soon-to-be ex-wife. I hadn't seen Sheila but once in the last 3 years, and at that time I was in no condition to contemplate my emotions. Now, it was with no little surprise and with a growing sense of relief that what I felt was nothing. Well, that wasn't true. I felt something, but it wasn't the soul-searing, blinding hot rage that kept me from giving up. It wasn't the swirling tempest of emotions that once kept me company. It wasn't the murderous hatred that had soothed my soul for a time. Rather, I felt a genuine sadness. I even experienced a kind of greatly muted love for Sheila, but that was simply a remembrance of days gone by. Something like an emotional monument to what Sheila and I once had. I did feel anger, but it was an anger at what I was sure Sheila had done to Amber. But if the police did their job correctly, she would be punished by the justice system. Even at that, as bizarre as it was, I didn't want to see Sheila jailed. I couldn't explain why I had that particular thought, other than it might have been a vestige of the love I once felt for the woman. Emotionally, I was solid as a rock, yet, strangely, my body unexpectedly reacted to the notion of seeing my wife after all this time. Perhaps it was a response to finally confronting her for what she had done to me and to Amber. I don't know, but whatever it was causing my hands to shake slightly and my body to vibrate and hum as if to a hidden tuning fork. "Are you all right?" asked Richards, as he eyed me critically. "If you're going to freak on me, then you stay out here. Never mind that. Instead, go to the main lobby and wait for me there." I shook my head in answer and in defiance. That seemed to pop me out of my muse and my body became calm and steady again. "Thanks for your concern, Lieutenant. I didn't know you cared, but I'm fine," I said sarcastically. Ignoring my sarcasm, he plowed on. "Are you sure? For a minute there you didn't look so good. I don't want you losing it and causing trouble." Meeting his eyes with my own, I replied in a calm voice, "Have you known me to do that? Since you've known me, have I ever given any indication to you that I would be a problem, Bernard?" Before he could reply, we both heard a woman's British accented voice. "Police Lieutenant, it would have been nice if you had informed me of your arrival. I need to speak with you and your partner before you interview the patient, Mrs. Pleasant." I was about to deny the accusation I was Richard's partner when the cop quickly spoke up. "Hello, Dr. Fatty. Good to finally put a face to the voice. And by the way, I don't think I have to check in with you to question a possible suspect, even if she is under your care. And that was a neat trick, having her moved from out of ICU to this room at the last minute. Perhaps to hide her from me? Anyway, we will not take long with Mrs. Pleasant. Afterwards, we will gladly meet with you to discuss whatever you would like to talk about." Richards fired off, nearly making his reply one long sentence, not allowing the doctor to reply, although she tried a couple of times. "Yes, you are quite right, Police Lieutenant. I don't have the authority to stop you from speaking with the patient. The problem is you are incorrect about the rest. What I was going to say, before your tirade, the patient has taken a turn for the worse and is still in the intensive care unit. As I explained to you, over the phone yesterday, we would monitor the patient for another 24 hours. Expecting her to be moved from intensive care this morning, I had a room prepared, but that has not been the case. Have you ever seen a cop turn red-faced from utter embarrassment? I hadn't either, until the doctor finished her explanation. But I have to hand it to Richards. He very neatly handled the reversal, and with no less than complete dignity. I see, acknowledged the lieutenant, with a deeply grave voice. A disquieting moment passed before the cop asked, in the same voice, to be taken to the ICU and to Sheila. Nodding curtly and with a terse, "Follow me," the doctor strode off. On the way, Richards asked the doctor several questions concerning Sheila's condition. Essentially, the questions were all oriented toward discovering if Sheila was yet cognitive enough to understand questions and respond intelligibly. A couple of times I was about to speak up and add my own questions, but each time Richards would somehow sense my purpose, catch my eye, and shake his head slightly. Curious as to what the cop was playing at, I followed his lead, hoping that I would soon find out. "You both have to understand, her condition is serious and might remain so for several days. Brain injuries are problematic and present many unique challenges to the patient, to the health providers, and to the patient's family. Although Mrs. Pleasant has recovered rather nicely, other symptoms might present themselves over a period of time. As is the case at this point, the brain remains a relative mystery, and even with today's advanced technologies, at times, the best we can do falls far short of what needs to be done. To answer your real question, for now, my best guess is that Mrs. Pleasant appears to be in a normal noetic state." "Okay, but what does noetic mean?" inquired the lieutenant. A look of concentration momentarily played over the doctor's face before she replied. "As we, in the neurosciences, apply the term, it refers to the ability of the human brain to perceive, process, and judge information, then to employ the data accordingly. Simplified, it means how good our human senses are, and how well we process the information acquired by our senses. In a baser way, it is whether we think something is real to us or imaginary." "I see." Richards had vocalized my exact thought. Looking quizzically at Richards, the doctor asked with a note of skepticism, "Do you actually understand, Lieutenant?" "I think I do, Doctor. It seems to me that someone is building an insanity defense. Think what you will, Police Lieutenant, but that is not what I stated and meant. Then again, I suspect you know that." I could see the doctor had become agitated at Richard's reply, but by then we had reached the ICU area. One other thing. As I've explained previously, Mrs. Pleasant has sustained severe head trauma, and because of those injuries, the patient has suffered some hearing loss, partial vision loss, and is experiencing speech difficulty. Don't let her appearance put you off, and certainly don't express any negative attitudes to the patient concerning her appearance. I can assure you she is well aware of her appearance. You won't have to mention it. She's lost an appreciable amount of weight, but until the patient is healthy enough to undergo corrective surgery, her ability to chew is extremely limited. Almost apologetically, the doctor further explained, "We can administer nutrients intravenously, and that maintains the patient's life, but such liquid sustenance does not impart any meaningful bulk." She added, but not before eyeing Richard and I, with a mildly disgusted look. "She does want to speak with the police, but she is still weak, both physically and emotionally. The patient's husband has not seen fit to visit her in all the time she's been here. If he had visited her, she might have recovered sooner, or possibly recovered with even better results. I don't know, but his absence has certainly not made it easy on his wife. I don't know what kind of man he is, but my perception of him is definitely not a decent one. Anyway, my point is, be easy with her. Have patience." "I have to agree with you, Dr. Fatty. I, too, don't know what kind of man the husband is, but he does have a bad tendency to annoy and frustrate people," Richard said with a slight smirk as he glanced at me sideways. "Right. Is there anything else you require of me?" asked the doctor. Richards told the doctor no, and surprisingly polite, overtly so, in my opinion, thanked her for the information and help. Dr. Fatty gave the cop one deeply appraising look before she accepted his thanks with a nod, explaining sternly, "You have 15 minutes with the patient, and no more. One of the nurses is constantly monitoring the patient's vital signs. If her vital signs should deviate to what we deem a critical level, you will leave the patient's presence immediately. Do you both understand?" We nodded as she glared at each of us individually. Somewhat satisfied, the doctor led us to a glass door, which she slid aside. It was more a cubicle than a room, with just enough space for the hospital bed, the various monitors and other hospital machines. I heard the doctor say, "Remember, 15 minutes, not a minute longer." But by then my attention was riveted to the form laying on the bed. Thus, her warning floated past my brain's ability to fully comprehend. I'd seen old photos and books of the prisoners liberated from the Nazi concentration camps of World War II. They were emaciated to the point of being literally nothing more than skin over bone. This was Sheila. To say I was shocked is a vast understatement. It was hard to equate my last clear memory of Sheila with the person who lay on the bed. The differences were just too contrary to immediately accept. This person's head was really more of a skull, wearing an eye patch, no less. Her left eye was closed, but sunk deeply into the socket, with its spherical shape being sharply defined within the orbit. Her hair was of medium length, but was stringy and ill-kempt, and shot with the abundance of silver strands, in piercing contrast to the remaining ginger color. Her facial skin was unnaturally glossy, sickly pale and stretched tightly over the bone, making it appear tissue thin. I could easily see the dark purple veins jutting out, coursing just under her semi-transparent skin. In contrast, the skin around her neck had a yellowish cast to it and hung in loose folds. Her arms lay beside the length of her body, exposed atop the bed sheet, but they weren't really arms. They appeared more like thin sticks covered with onion paper, the skin being of that color and that translucent. Her hands were claw-like, her fingers like small twigs, gnarled into a perverse deformity. Where the sheet covered her body, the contour, so displayed, was no less appalling. Sheila's body was a very narrow, nearly straight-edged form, whose symmetry was broken by the occasional bumpy protrusion of a joint. Only skin on bones, that is all I could see. Aghast as I felt, I wasn't so caught up by the horror laying on the bed that I didn't hear Richards. "Move it, Pleasant," he ordered in a low hiss. "You're blocking the door." Hesitatingly, I took a couple of steps into the small ICU room, then stepping off to the side, trying to stay as far away from that which occupied the bed. "What's the matter with you? Haven't you ever seen sick people before? Don't be a shit. She's still your wife, so act like a husband," Richard snarled, in a low-pitched voice. Perhaps it was Richard's voice, or maybe it was our presence. Regardless of the cause, Sheila stirred, then opened her eye. She scanned the room for a moment before seeing us. Upon spying me, her eye widened in surprise. Then she smiled, or tried to. It was more a pained grimace. Then she spoke, saying, I'm not sure what she said. It sounded like lol. She said it over and over, getting louder with each utterance. Sheila's mouth hardly moved in her attempt to talk. "I think she's saying your name," opined the lieutenant. I stared at Sheila for another moment, trying to accept the condition of a woman I'd once loved and cherished. She had looked away for a moment, in Richard's direction, before looking at me again. "Hello, Sheila." That set Sheila off on another round of unintelligibility. Dismay filled me as I began to realize the futility of the situation. The doctor had failed to fill in the finer details of Sheila's condition when she spoke to us. There was no doubt in my mind that the good doctor had been fully aware of Sheila's inability to communicate, at least, so she could be understood. Meaning my wife was not going to be able to admit to anything. Helpless in the face of such an unexpected turn of events, I looked to Richards, hoping he might have some reassurances to offer. But he was staring at Sheila, his head cocked, concentrating on whatever she was trying to say. After a minute, in which Sheila continued to make noises, he shook his head sadly. "I am sorry, Mrs. Pleasant. Try as I might, I can't understand what you're saying." He spoke slowly, clearly, and loudly, like one might when talking to an obtuse child. Feeling at a total loss, I looked at Sheila again. She was looking back at me, still making those god-awful noises, and I saw a single tear leave her good eye and run down her hollow cheek. For some reason that I couldn't fathom, that single tear inspired me to try something, anything, to communicate with my erstwhile wife. "Sheila, listen, I want to try something to help talk with you, but you need to calm down." "Okay," I said in the calmest and most sincere tone of voice I could muster. She must have heard me, because she stopped trying to talk and simply gazed steadily at me. "Good. Now, can you move your head? Like, in a nod? She closed her eye and looked to be straining as her head moved just slightly. Never mind, Sheila. How about? Without conscious thought, a barely recalled article about some guy who wrote a book by blinking his eye came to mind. What was his name? Baby? No, Bobby. It was some French guy. He had a heart attack, or maybe it was a stroke, and had been paralyzed, and he still managed to write a book. Maybe I could use a similar method to communicate with Sheila. How about you blink once for no and twice for yes? If you agree, blink twice slowly. Sheila's one good eye widened in surprised pleasure, and a small smile played on her lips before she blinked 2 times, slowly. I heard Richard say, "You're full of surprises, pleasant," with a tinge of grudging respect. I smiled inwardly at the lieutenant's unintended praise. Sheila, this is Lieutenant Richards from the New York City Police Department. He is here to ask you some questions. Is that okay with you? She blinked twice. Good. Also, if you don't know the answer to a question, blink 3 times, slowly. Do you understand? 2 more blinks. Yes. I turned my gaze to Richards, nodding, indicating he should take over. He gave me a tight smile before focusing his attention on Sheila. Hello, Mrs. Pleasant. As your husband has stated, I am Lieutenant Bernard Richards of the New York Police Department. I do apologize for meeting you in this way, but I have been wanting to speak with you about the incident that gravely injured you and put you in the hospital. So, I'm going to ask a few questions regarding the accident. Are you okay with that? Yes. I was taken aback by the policeman's line of questioning. I was sure he would be asking about Amber's accident, not Sheila's. Okay. Now, did you see the car that hit you? Yes. Was it a light color?
No.
Was it a dark color? Yes. The questioning went on like this for a few minutes, slowly narrowing the account to a set of specifics before the lieutenant asked the $1 million question. My attention had been focused on Sheila, watching her reactions as she blinked replies to each of Richard's queries. I was still not happy that Richards hadn't once mentioned Amber's accident. Our time was almost up, so I was understandably frustrated by how it had thus far gone. Do you know who drove the car that hit you? Immediately, Sheila tensed up, her face becoming even more drawn than warranted by her physical condition. Once more she started her nonsensical uttering. She'd become so excited, Sheila had forgotten to blink her answer. Please, Mrs. Pleasant, blink your reply, exclaimed the cop calmly. Despite Richard's professional demeanor, I could clearly tell that his patience was wearing thin. Sheila finally stopped her babbling. Taking a deep breath and slowly exhaling, she blinked twice. Glancing to see my reaction, the cop quickly turned back to Sheila. I wasn't overly excited at discovering who had run into Sheila. Not that I didn't care. It was only that I cared more in discovering who had run over Amber. Considering the sour look Richards gave me before looking away, I suspected the cop knew my thoughts. Just so I can be certain of your answer, I'll ask the question again. Do you know who drove the car that hit you? Yes. Is it a woman? Nope. Is it a man? Yes. Okay. I have a couple of more questions. But first, I want to thank you for your patience and effort, Mrs. Pleasant. I truly appreciate it. You've done remarkably well, and we are almost done. However, to be honest, the most difficult part of this is about to begin. Taking a pause to ensure Sheila had time to comprehend what he had said, Richards finished with a request. I'll need you to identify the driver. The smile of pleasure that had etched Sheila's thin face at the lieutenant's appreciative words turned into a look of helpless frustration at his last sentence. But, he quickly added, in that surprising kind and gentle tone, please, don't worry. I think I have a solution that will allow you to ID him easily. Okay. Yes. Thank you. Now, to begin, what I suggest is that I state a letter of the alphabet, and when a letter matches the first letter of the person's name, instead of blinking, simply try to say yes. I realize you might not be able to reply coherently, but I will ask you to verify the letter with 2 blinks. If it isn't the letter, then remain silent for a couple of seconds, and I will move on the another letter, and so on. I think this will go faster and smoother than only blinking. Plus, I'm concerned that your eye is becoming tired with the effort you've already applied. Are you good with that? Yes. Great. We'll start with the person's first name. Here is the first letter A. Silence. B. Silence. So it went. Letter after letter. Some she made sounds to, while the rest drew a hush. I wasn't paying any particular attention to the proceedings, and my mind wandered to Amber and her own injuries and tribulations. I was yet certain that Sheila had been involved, either directly or indirectly, with hitting Amber. And the cop's apparent lack of interest in Amber's case and obvious interest in Sheila's case had me mystified as to his motivation. Eventually, my mind moved on, meandering through one memory after another of my time in France with Amber. It was this deep train of thought that my attention was broken from as I heard my name called. "Joe, snap out of it," commanded a growling male voice. I brought my eyes into focus and then turned toward Richards. "Yeah? What? Have you heard the name before?" "Your wife thinks you have," he asked without any premise. What name?" "Pay attention, Pleasant," Richards demanded with a bit of exasperation. "Have you heard of a Gary Evan Strasberg?" "Gary Strasberg?" The name did sound familiar, but refused to find placement in any context within my memory. Maybe Amber might know. Wait, I had known that name. Recognition came of a sudden, with a complete and clear memory of who he was. Yes, I do know him. He was one of the guys that Amber went out with some time ago. Why? What does he have to do with Sheila? Was she screwing him too? I didn't ask that question aloud, but my tone certainly implied the question. Unsolicited thoughts entered my head, returning me to the night, so long ago, of when I'd first seen the video. I felt a renewal of the old anger begin to build. The lieutenant threw me a look of brief surprise, which quickly turned to disgust. "Your wife has told me who ran her off the road. And, as you're so fond of saying, it was no accident." I looked over at Sheila, and although she met my eye with the merest of smiles, she went back to gazing at Richards. I took that as an interesting development. "Well, that's great. But what do you mean it was no accident?" I asked sarcastically, through gritted teeth. "Wow, have you really been so lost in your thoughts you didn't bother listening to what your wife and I have discussed over the last hour?" The cop rubbed his chin, while he gave me a speculative look. Before I could reply, he said, "Never mind. I'll fill you in on the way back to the city." The last hour? I looked at my watch and I was stunned at how long we'd been in Sheila's room. 85 minutes. How did you manage to avoid the 15-minute restriction? It wasn't me. If you had been paying attention, you would have known that your wife wanted to continue with the interview. At her insistence, the doctor okayed it. I slowly nodded at the explanation, while moving away from the wall where I'd been leaning since I'd entered the room. My joints were stiff and ached from supporting my weight for such a lengthy time of immobility. I groaned from the unexpected pain, and Sheila looked my way again. Her single eye spoke volumes. I knew what she wanted to hear from me before we left, but my feelings had not changed despite Sheila's condition. Sure, I felt bad for her. Who wouldn't? I just didn't have it in me to lie or to express what I didn't feel. "I'll be back in a minute," said the policeman over his shoulder, while hurriedly walking out of the room. Feeling awkward and uneasy at being alone with Sheila and the sole recipient of her attention, I decided to leave as well. But first, Sheila, I'm sorry for what's happened to you. Although, at one time I would have rejoiced at your circumstance, I have to admit that it doesn't fill me with any joy seeing you like this. The one-time love of my life smiled gratefully at my words, and her eye glistened with unshed tears of happiness as she looked at me with what I assumed was adoration. "I wish I could say you're." I waved my hand in her direction, indicating her physical condition, that your present condition has changed things. But it hasn't. If a person, as near to a skeleton without being one, could deflate, then Sheila deflated. Tears began to leak from her eye, but they were no longer drops of pleasure. Fanciful images of Sheila having sex with Gary had filled my mind at the moment of Richard's question concerning Gary. The anger steadily built, threatening to unleash a torrent of verbal vomitus and to heap it on Sheila. Somehow, I managed to contain it while remaining calm on the exterior. Yet, I was due a pound of flesh. Then, at that moment, just when I was going to twist the knife, Bridget's words of forgiveness came crashing into my head, invading my mind. "If you want to move forward, I think you must forgive her." That unheralded memory caused a great emotion to course through me, swiftly washing away the anger, the pain, and the need for revenge, leaving an even greater peace. It was a serenity I'd not known since I was a child. I don't know what this emotion was. I'd never felt its kind before, but if one had to apply a description, it would definitely be more toward the spiritual side. Not that I was particularly religious, but as with most people, I did loosely believe in a higher being. Still, this sudden change in heart, in spite of the tranquility it brought, left me unsettled and bewildered as to how I should to treat my wife. Were these new set of emotions I was now feeling the bridge to forgiving Sheila? I sensed they were. Nevertheless, I still knew that there was no returning to her. I regarded Sheila with a new perspective, not as the cuck husband, but as a person set free of the bonds that enslaved me to the emotional trauma of having an adulteress as a wife. As I stared at Sheila, I saw her face change as she gazed at me. Ever so slowly, her aspect went from the emotional anguish of rejection to a momentary hopefulness, then to a resigned sadness. I suppose she read my face, with her single eye, just as well as I read hers. And, as Sheila's face settled into its final expression, she made a few noises of distress, which I took as objection to the resoluteness I imagined I emanated. I am truly sorry, Sheila, but you know me well enough to realize that I'm not the kind of man to stay married to a woman that's cheated. However, if it means anything to you, I do forgive you. She had closed her eye as I began speaking, but opened it in surprise at my last words, and a wan smile formed on her lips. I returned her smile, albeit briefly. I want you to get better. I'll check with the doctor to see what else you'll need so you can get better. Whatever it takes, I'll make sure you get it. A look of concern filled her face and she made a noise of protest. I assumed it was due to the medical costs of her recovery. I wasn't sure if Sheila still had medical insurance since I had taken her off of mine. Don't worry about the costs. I'll pay for whatever treatment you require. Sheila seemed to settle down at my promise, but tensed up at the opening of my next words. One more thing. I'll postpone the divorce proceedings until you're fully recovered. This is to give you the chance to talk with me about your side of things before we're divorced. Her face contorted as several emotions played across it, until only a deep sadness lay upon it once more. I know it isn't what you want to hear, but it's the best I can do. Anyway, I'll see you again in a couple of days. Bye, Sheila. I hurriedly walked out without waiting for Richards to return. I saw the same doctor that had led us to the ICU, standing near the main desk for the floor. I started toward the doctor, fully intending to discuss Sheila's condition and treatment with her. I was wondering why her doctors hadn't completely filled me in on Sheila's condition. With all the times I'd called and spoken to them, they'd never once actually gone into the specifics of neither her condition nor her appearance. My arm was grabbed, stopping me, and at the same instant I heard a voice ask, "Where are you going?" "I'm going to talk to the doctor," I said while I tried to pull free. "No, you're not. You can call the doc later, or talk to her when you return in the couple of days you told your wife you would. Right now, we are, as in, I am, leaving," stated Richards, in a voice that brooked no argument. Ignoring his last statement, I said accusingly, "You were spying," while I gave him what I thought was a withering look. In return, he gave me a pained look. "Nope, but I was about to re-enter the room when I heard you talking. So, I waited for you to finish. I can't help that you talk so loudly. Now can I?" I gave him another withering glare, but cops must be immune to such things, as all he did was grin and say, "Come on, I'll buy lunch this time." Despite my insistence for an explanation upon leaving the hospital, it wasn't until after we had stopped for lunch and were several minutes down the road when the lieutenant finally broke his silence. "As much as I hate to admit it, you were right about the hit and run on your girlfriend not being an accident," began Richards. I started at this unexpected revelation. I decided not to rub it in. Well, maybe just a little. I could say I told you so, but being that I'm the bigger man, I won't. So, did Sheila finally admit to it? Richards turned to give me a baleful look, then back to watching the road before replying. "No, you're completely off base there. As I told you before." I shrugged it as I told you so. "Okay, so how was Sheila involved?" "She wasn't." Are you saying she had nothing to do with Amber being hit by that car? Yup, replied the policeman with a cheerfulness that irritated me. Okay, so if Sheila wasn't involved, then how did she know who did it? A niggling thought wormed its way to the forefront of my mind and exploded. Wait, was it that guy, Gary Strauss or whatever, that did it? Is that why you were asking me about him? Strasberg. What? The suspect's name is Strasberg. Gary Evan Strasberg. Okay, did he do it? It seems so, he answered with more cheer than such an answer warranted. The lieutenant's calm and upbeat disposition grated on my nerves, making me irritated. In fact, the last 6 months had, of a sudden, at that moment, become a gut-wrenching, mind-boggling ordeal. I felt like puking up the greasy cheeseburger and fries that were lunch. Instead, I swallowed my bile and took slow, easy breaths. Taken individually, Amber's hit and run, Sheila being off the road. Each incident was emotionally manageable, with Sheila's being more so than Amber's. To be informed there was another individual involved that deliberately tried to kill both women crumbled to dust my carefully held and cherished belief concerning Sheila. I had been so certain Sheila had done it, I'd have bet my life on it. It took some effort to accept the policeman's words and begin coming to terms with it. And that brought to mind some questions that I didn't think could be answered so readily. Several seconds passed before I felt calm enough to return to the discussion. Before I could say anything, Richards, with some concern in his voice, asked, "Are you okay?" "Yeah, I am fine. You don't look fine. I don't want you being sick in my car, so if you need me to pull over, I am fine," I said loudly, interrupting Richards. With one final speculative glance, he shrugged, saying, "Okay, you're fine. You were saying that this guy, Gary Strasberg, ran Sheila off the road and hit Amber. If Sheila is not involved, then how does she know all that?" "She saw him." "Wait, that doesn't make sense. She saw him run Amber over, and she never reported it? Come on. Does that sound like what an innocent person would do, Lieutenant Richards?" At this time, I'm not ready to conclude anything based on the scant evidence at hand. Until I thoroughly check out your wife's story, I'm not going to accuse her of anything. I tried to interrupt, but Richards talked right over my objections. "I grant you, she could be lying through her teeth. Until I can compare the forensic evidence gathered at the scene of both incidents, I will just have to operate as if she's telling the truth. Believe me, Mr. Pleasant, I want to know the truth as much as you. But that truth must be supported by the evidence." I mulled over what the cop said. Did I want the truth, or did I just want to see Sheila pay for something she might not have done? It should have been a no-brainer, especially because of the epiphany I'd had in Sheila's room, but surprisingly I wasn't sure of my motivation. I shook myself, saving such musings for another time, turning my attention back to Richards. "Okay, what else did she say, or blink to you?" "That Gary Strasberg ran her off the road, and that's all I got from her." It isn't easy trying to get information from a person who can't talk and can't use their hands to write. Hopefully, she'll soon be able to do one or the other. If so, then at that time, I'll need to question her again. "What about Gary Strasberg? What do you plan on doing about him? If what Sheila's indicated is the truth, he's gone after 2 women and nearly killed them. What's to stop him from going after either one of them again?" Richards gave me a funny look as he replied, "I've already sent out an ATL and asked the staff of both hospitals to limit visitation to only known family members. I've also asked for a uniform to be placed outside your girlfriend's hospital room. As soon as we've located Strasberg, we'll bring him in for questioning." I'm sure I wore an incredulous expression at his explanation, for he offered, with a slight shrug, "I called it in when I left your wife's room. It's what I was doing as you talked with her." "Okay, I have another question. What is ATL?" For whatever reason, my question had Richards laughing. It's police shorthand for attempt to locate a person. In this case, it refers to finding Mr. Strasberg. We didn't say much after that. Each of us lost in our respective thoughts. Mine were trying to understand what I felt in regard to Sheila's story. So with silence as our third companion, we arrived in the city. After Richards and I left the hospital, the nurse that first had deciphered Sheila's speech came in to check on her. Apparently, Sheila had somehow managed to convey the following to her, which I was later informed of. Thus these are her unspoken words. The pain flowed and ebbed. Sometimes it was bad, very bad. At other times, it was bearable, just barely. It was the worst when I tried to talk. Some parts of my jaw, according to one of the doctors, the temporomandibular joints, were broken and had to be surgically sculpted to fit right. It was like having a dislocated jaw, only way worse. Either way, I was unable to move my jaw very much, making chewing impossible. Talking had become a little easier, but my tongue would still not move as it should to make the words I so desperately wanted to be heard and understood. I was still nearly unintelligible. Even to my own hearing, my attempts at talking sounded so much like gibberish. It was all very frustrating and filled me with a sense of helplessness and anger. My hearing was better, but not by much. I'd lost almost all hearing in my right ear. The little ear bones had been damaged and caused what my doctors called conductive deafness. I could hear only the loudest sounds and just barely, at that. My left was okay, but words and other common noises sounded very differently from what I remembered when I had two good ears. I was told a specialized hearing aid, implanted in my bad ear, could improve my hearing close to normal. The worst of it was my reduced vision. I no longer had a right eye. My left was always the weakest of the two, and now it was telling. My eye watered constantly from the strain. I looked like a weepy-eyed pirate on a hunger strike. The doctors explained I would eventually get a prosthetic eye, but only after all reconstructive surgery was completed. Something to do with the shape and size of my orbit, changing with each successive surgical procedure. It is so easy to take for granted that which we are born with and expect to have for a lifetime. I no longer simply accepted things, and I no longer took things for granted. Despite my angry frustrations at my physical disabilities, I was also happy that I still had what I had. When I first came to, after all those months of being in a coma, I could not understand, then later, believe what had happened to me. At first, I felt numb all over and couldn't move. Then the pain hit. Something in my head hurt, then slowly the pain shifted to my jaw. I guess I must have been trying to talk, or probably scream. Nothing came out, yet. I saw two nurses next to me. One was moving her mouth, and I began to hear her words, although her voice sounded tinny. The first couple of days after awakening were filled with tests and exams. Although I could not talk, somehow the doctors were able to determine I was mentally able. I received one of my biggest shocks when one of the nurses began to feed me through a tube in my stomach. They called it a nasogastric tube, and yes, they explained it all to me. Why they had to do it and how long I would be using it, and it was a nightmare. Only, I couldn't wake up from it. I think the worst part of it all was having no one visit me. As far as I knew, none of my family had come to see me. No friends. No one. I hadn't expected anyone to come see me. Yet, I had hoped someone would. Then the memories of my accident came to me. Despite the pain, I began shouting. One of the nurses eventually understood me, because I heard one explain to another that she thought I was talking about the accident. Seeped in pain. For one brief moment, I was overjoyed. Someone had understood me. They promptly sedated me, and did so again. The second time I tried to talk about my accident, and ended up just screaming in near insanity. I was so frustrated, so angry, and so helpless, that I wasn't able to keep it together. Finally, after being sedated the last time, I shut up about it. Then Joe came. I was sleeping, or trying to, but my mind was in never-ending turmoil. I was so alone and so lonely, and with my injuries, I just wanted to die. I would have killed myself when I awoke from the coma, only I couldn't move, and I doubted any of the medical staff would help me do that, even if I could have communicated my desire to them. I don't know what prompted me to open my eye. Maybe I sensed someone other than the hospital staff in the room. I like to think it was a resurgence of the bond of love I had with Joe that sensed his presence. Whatever it was that prompted me to open my eye, when I did, I glanced around until I saw Joe standing there. He looked so good. I was so happy. I said his name. I tried to. I said it over and over, trying so hard to pronounce that one short word. For some unknown reason, it was so important to do that. Then, I heard a sound, well, words being spoken by someone else. But they were spoken so low my diminished hearing couldn't make them out. I looked around the room and I saw a stranger. He didn't look very happy. I swiveled my eye back to Joe and I heard him say my name. I couldn't have been happier when I heard my name come from his lips. I was so excited. I started to talk. Joe's eyes opened in shock, and then a crestfallen look came over his face. But then, Joe's face lit up. He explained his idea of how I could communicate, and I was beyond happiness at that point. My Joe, in an instant, had came up with something that even my good doctors hadn't thought of. I was only too glad to comply. Joe went on to explain who the stranger was, so I turned my eye to the policeman. I was both surprised and excited at the prospect of finally being able to be understood about what had happened to me. I was going to be able to share the person's identity who had run me off the road, nearly killing me. It was the same person whom had hit and killed Amber. Only, it wasn't until I'd seen him again, right before he ran his car into mine, that I recognized him. He'd been a short-term boyfriend of Amber's several years ago, one of many she'd had and dumped. I'd had some time to think since I'd awakened, and at first, although I'd had but vague impressions instead of clear memories of my own accident, I'd also had a strong sense of déjà vu about it. Initially, I'd thought it had been an accident, but after giving it some thought, I was certain Gary had tried to kill me. At first, I wasn't sure why he would want to kill me. Then after some more thought, and on remembering Amber's accident, it hit me. I'd seen the entire thing, as I spied on Joe and Amber. After the car hit Amber, it sped around the corner and right by me. I saw the face of the driver for a split second as the car flew by me, much the same way I'd seen his face when Gary ran me off the road, into that ravine. At that point, I was sure Gary was trying to kill the only witness to his murder of Amber, which meant it hadn't been an accident. Why he killed Amber, I had no idea. The police could figure that out. After Joe and the policeman left, I was vastly relieved that someone in authority now knew of what had transpired with Gary. I was also hugely elated that Joe had talked to me. It was well outside of the perfect situation I had imagined when meeting Joe, but at least he had finally spoken to me after so long a time. I still wanted him to return to me, but the overwhelming obsession I'd had about Joe was now gone. In its place was a deep sadness. It was like an old sorrow that felt far distant from the then-present time of my hospitalization. Looking at Joe, right before he left, I knew, deep in my heart, he would not be coming back to me. I knew that a divorce would soon become a fact of our broken marriage. Strangely enough, I was no longer engulfed by an emotional abyss at the thought of divorce.